from myself and Dr. Michele Groppi once again for another podcast of It's Verona. Today, for the series on political economy, development, and energy security, we are honored to have with us Tomas Maltby. Tomas is a senior lecturer in international politics at the Department of Political Economy of King's College, and he's specialized in European Union energy and climate policy, and among other things, the securitization of energy and climate skepticism. And these are some of the topics we will discuss with him over the next 10 to 12 minutes. Furthermore, please allow me to say that I've had the privilege to work with Tomas when I still was a very inexperienced teacher assistant. I think it was back in 2015. Tomas was a great convener, and so if you are around at King's College, do check out his modules on the international politics of energy and global power Europe. Tomas, once again, thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for the invite and for the kind words. You're an excellent teacher as well, so I can say that about you.
Thank you, Tomas. Okay, I'll hand it over to Dr. Michele Groppi.
Dr. Maltby, once again, many thanks for being here today. We're very honored. I'm going to try to start off the conversation by asking you something fairly general about energy security, because we keep hearing the term over and over and over, right, in the political discourse and all that. But in your words, what is energy security, and why is it important to talk about it, and how do we approach it as academics?
Sure. Well, thank you, and thanks again for inviting me. It's a good question, and it's not an easy question to answer, because I think energy security, like any form of security, means different things to different people. I think there is a kind of qualitative aspect to this as well as a quantitative aspect, and so we can think, okay, well, what does energy security mean in Europe or globally? And we could think, well, that's going to consist of some kind of key tenets. It's going to consist of, security of supply, security of energy supply. Sort of how secure is that? Is there any kind of risk of disruption? We're going to think about affordability to residential consumers, but to businesses. We're going to think also, I suppose, depending on which country we're talking about, security of demand. So if you're a country that depends very highly on oil and gas revenues, then this is going to be a slightly different understanding of security. And then the environmental aspect. So these kind of three to four kind of dimensions, I think, are really key. And then I guess a sort of follow-up part of that is, well, we can quantify some of those. We can say, okay, well, to what extent is a country or a region exposed and vulnerable in terms of how much of their energy is imported, or perhaps how much of their energy is imported from a single country, and or kind of more qualitative judgment, is that single country an ally, an enemy? Is it problematic, that import dependence on them? Affordability, I mean, it is also something where we can have kind of quantitative assessment of affordability, and we can have qualitative. I mean, we live in a world where at least now, energy prices are relatively low, and oil prices have dramatically decreased recently. At the same time, depending on what country you're in, or which part of what country you're in, energy poverty is still a big issue. So some 50 million people in Europe are still suffering from energy poverty and kind of struggling to pay their bills. And then environmental, I mean, that's really tough. We can definitely come up with some quantitative indicators there about, well, what percentage of the energy mix is from renewable energy, what percentage of the investment goes into renewable energy technologies, for example. But whether that makes a country or region environmentally secure is another question. Whether that investment is significantly ambitious or sufficiently ambitious is another question. So I think energy security does mean different things to different people, and our judgment of the extent to which a country or region is energy secure is open to some subjective interpretation.
Thank you very much. Given what you just said, right, that energy security means different things to different people, and there are a number of parameters that can be used in order to assess, in order to measure what this may or may not mean, right? I know this is another very broad question, but how would you consider Europe Like, let's say in terms of affordability, in terms of, I'm not gonna call it efficiency, but like, once again, we'll be hearing a lot of talk, like in the political discourse, we're not secure as for energy security, in fact. Is that true? Is that accurate? Or what are your thoughts in general about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's become a key priority for the European Union and beyond in Europe to increase energy security, and it's quite clear in some regards what that means, which is those sort of tenets I set out, which is it's about environmental protection, it's about affordability, it's about security of supply. Whether that is improved or not. So let's take security of supply. It's been a key objective of the EU for more than a decade to reduce the dependency on imports, as well as to diversify where those imports come from. And on some measures, that's been an abject failure. So we can say, okay, in sort of 2007, something like 53% of all of the EU's energy was imported, and now it's 55. Gas was considered a problem, that much of the gas came from a single source, Russia, and much of the gas was imported. Well, the amount of gas that Europe uses, which is imported, has gone from 60% to like 74% in a decade. So by some indicators, this has been a failure. The EU does not produce any more gas than it used to. It's had some success, though, in increasing some domestically produced energy, such as renewable energy. It has had some success in diversifying the sources of energy that it uses and which countries these come from. It has also had some success in saying, okay, to each of its member states, well, you need to put in place some plans. So if there is some disruption, you've got emergency plans that kick in. There's some kind of solidarity mechanisms by which you can call upon your neighbor to support this, that you've got reserves that you've developed. So it depends how we look at that. In terms of security supply, as a kind of holistic kind of sort of package, it's probably improved somewhat. But some of those indicators would suggest it's in a similarly negative position. But then also it depends on, is dependence on Russia a negative thing? Some member states are going to think that, and some are going to think it to a lesser extent. So it's not completely clear whether that is a negative or not. In terms of affordability, as I said, that sort of 10% of something of Europe's population that is in energy poverty, that is still a big problem for the EU to deal with and for its member states to deal with. And it's just so unpredictable, the cost of energy. Over a longer term, you can think, to kind of link this with environmental issues, that over time you can bring down the cost of energy, you can make it more predictable by developing kind of indigenous renewable energy technologies, of which the cost of those technologies is going down. But year to year, month to month, day to day, it's very hard to predict, whether the cost of energy, where it's going to be. And for many people, it's still a very significant part of their expenditure. So, whether that's affordable or not, that's it's a hard one to answer. But it's a big problem in certain countries and certain parts of certain countries. Environmentally, that's tough as well. That's the EU is by many measures a leader in terms of developing renewable energy technologies and setting emissions targets reductions and setting an emissions trading system and trying to sort of tax carbon. This is really positive. But could it go further? I mean, it's a pragmatic actor. It has to mediate between those actors within it who are more ambitious and less ambitious. So whether overall it is more secure in that or not is, I think, a tough one to answer. And obviously, I suppose, with environmental protection, with climate change, it also depends on the actions of others. So to what extent can the EU set standards, set an example, set norms of behavior which others follow, I think is a real challenge. Maybe the fact that the US is not so much of a leader in terms of environmental issues and climate change at the moment gives Europe an opening, a window. And I'll maybe come back to this later, but a big question now is, does the EU, which of those aspects of energy security does the EU prioritize? To what extent does the economy trump environmental protection, or to what extent can they go hand in hand? I think this is a real challenge.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
Thank you, Thomas. Given that you're interested also in climate skepticism, and considering that energy security is something very tangible, we see it, at least, I feel it, I experience it every day in my everyday life, and it's quite tangible in that regard. Climate change is not quite the same, in my opinion. So how would you convince that? How would you explain to a skeptic that there is a relationship between climate change and energy security?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and it does depend a little bit on what we mean by sort of climate denial or climate skepticism, whether it's an outright refusal to accept or to contest the fact that weather systems and the climate is changing. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that this is no longer a medium or a long-term issue. It is now. So the past 5 years globally have all been the hottest on record. Right? So the hottest 5 have been the last 5. I think in February, the Antarctic registered a temperature of more than 20 degrees centigrade, and that was the first time that's ever happened. I think the Arctic is 12 degrees warmer than normal, and in London we've got some of the warmest, driest weather, which follows some of the wettest weather, I think, in February, and so April, May, some of the warmest and driest. So you can make an argument about the change that is happening now that is unprecedented. You can sort of prove that. But I think then there's other questions if you're trying to engage with someone who is denying this, which is, okay, well, do they accept that the reason for this is because of human activity? Do they accept that the cause of this has anything to do with them or their country? And do they accept that the solutions that are being put forward have anything to do with other solutions that might be promoted by other countries, for example? So is the way out of this to cut coal production? Is the way out of this to promote renewable energy technology? Or maybe none of it matters because another country, call it China, it is not doing this. So I think it depends on what level we're engaging with it. But whether this is useful or not, but it certainly seems to be that some of the clear evidence of dramatic climate change is happening now and is visible, and we do see it and we do experience it. Whether that's enough to change those who are skeptical, no, often, because then there's a question about who's responsible and what an effective policy response to this should be. And to come back to something I mentioned earlier, which is, okay, well, what are the trade-offs? Who pays for this? What are the benefits? Is it clear what the benefits are going to be to this action? And what about the costs? Sometimes I think it's easier to consider the costs to the individual, to the industry of a country, to the country more generally, than it is to consider the benefits. And I think that's a real challenge.
Thank you, Thomas. And trying to link our discussion to something very topical these days, how do you think COVID will impact these kind of issues, energy security and climate change?
Yeah, I think it's potentially going to have very significant effects. And, I talked about energy security can mean security of demand, somewhat obvious. But the cost of oil has been so low and is now still, even though it's increased over the last month or so, it's still below what most oil exporting states require to balance their budgets and to balance their welfare payments and to balance their security budgets and their arms industry and things. So what that means, I guess one outcome is that everything gets back to normal, a kind of V-shaped economic recovery in which there's just a blip and it doesn't really matter. But if it's in any way longer term or medium term, then it could lead to sort of regime instability. It could lead to a more positive and that can have positive and negative outcomes. It could lead to a sort of more, okay, we need to diversify our economies. This is much harder to do than it sounds, and it's much harder for those countries that even engage and want to do this. It's a real challenge to kind of wean yourself off that dependence on oil and gas exports. So I think for those producer countries, this is a very significant challenge. What other effects might it have? Well, there were figures out earlier in the week which suggested that the effect has been an average 17% reduction in emissions. And over the year, people are estimating that might be some 7% reduction in emissions. And this is both sort of has a positive and negative side to it. One is, I suppose, that the thing that the people have been pointing out, which is, okay, if we are to try and contain climate change and global warming to about 1.5 degrees, that's going to have to happen every year. And even for 2 degrees, something on that similar kind of scale is going to have to start happening. So we can see the effect, I suppose, of human action and we can see the scale of change that is necessary, that actually it's going to require sort of widespread change, almost some degree of structural change about aviation and shipping and heating, etc. Now, whether any of this, it's far too early to say, but whether any of this means that people start to think, okay, yes, we see the role of human activity, so that maybe changes, or we see that there's some kind of co-benefits in terms of, say, air quality, that actually that kind of pushes countries to have more ambitious sort of policy, climate policy, renewables policy, environmental policy. That's I think that's open to debate. There's a very live discussion going on within Europe and elsewhere about, okay, well, what do we do now? So one of the exit trajectories from this is to say, okay, then any kind of economic stimulus comes with conditionality. So you bail out the aviation industry, you bail out the fossil fuel industry, you offer some kind of loans there where they come with some conditions, which are environmental, that it means cutting emissions, it means cutting flights, for example. So there is an opportunity for states to kind of pursue this. At the same time, there's very loud voices and persuasive voices, I'm sure, to some, which is, okay, no, that has to be put on hold. What we need to do is prioritize economic recovery, and then we can come to deal with this issue. The United Nations climate conference has been postponed, so it's going to be this year, and it's now going to be in Glasgow. It's now going to be next year. Whether this is an opportunity to propose something even more ambitious sort of next year, or whether it's being pushed off the agenda, I think is not known yet. I think there's a lot of contestation still there to happen before we can determine what comes out. And it's going to vary from country to country. We're going to have different outcomes to that debate in different countries.
Thank you, Thomas. Just very briefly, as we conclude this podcast, given that you were speaking about agendas, obviously, I think everyone could see how relatively, I mean, with all the problems that we've seen, but how relatively quickly the world has securitized COVID. It's not the same with climate change. Personally, I come from a different background compared to you, so I think there is an obvious answer there, which is that COVID was an imminent threat. I was just wondering whether you could see more nuances than I can with regard to this issue.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question. It's something I've been thinking about a lot. And yeah, I think there was a moment, I don't know if the moment is past or we're still in it, where there was a recognition that this was a security threat, COVID, and this was fairly universal, almost entirely universal around the world and within countries. There was a security threat, that was an emergency, that in response there needed to be an emergency policy response, sometimes an unprecedented response, and this was legitimate, and this was accepted. So there was a high degree of public and political consensus. However, we just from reading contemporary news reports, we're aware that is not a complete consensus. It does appear in some places maybe that consensus is fraying, and what we see there quite often is this, this discussion about whether we prioritize sort of security of public health or whether we prioritize economic security. So similarly, I think if we apply this to climate change, yeah, the point you made, which is how imminent is that? I mean, I can say all these things about, look, you can look out the window and see this. Not everyone's going to accept that or accept what the cause of it is. So I think there's far less consensus about the problem, far less consensus about the solution. However, we do see some sort of parallels there with that contestation with even those who might agree on the problem, disagree on the kind of scales and the relative kind of scale of the problem. So if we're looking at the short-term cost, do we mitigate against climate change and try and prevent it? Or do we just try and absorb the cost and adapt to climate change that is happening? Maybe it's unstoppable. Well, I think that those similar debates are going on with COVID. So, yeah, I mean, again, it shows, if you're an optimist, it shows that there is the potential to have some degree of consensus globally, despite the very different, political economy of these different states, the very different kind of societies and cultures. And if you're a pessimist, you can see, well, that consensus doesn't hold for too long, and you can see significant variation. And there wasn't even complete consensus at the time. So, yeah, whether this is considered imminent, whether climate change is considered imminent. I mean, it seems like the distant past, but the last autumn through to winter, it did appear with Greta Thunberg and others and Fridays for Future that climate change as an issue in the kind of public sphere, but also I think on the political sphere, had been elevated. It was a really high degree of concern. It was really on the agenda. There was a lot of talk about kind of change. And I think the real question is, okay, in 3 months, in 6 months, is it still there? And does some of this rhetorical kind of commitment to dealing, let's set a net zero target or something, is that going to be filled in with policy and legislation? Is it actually going to be implemented, or is it just some kind of empty rhetoric? So, yeah. And I think an open question is, to what extent are these in some way combined, that there's some sort of co-benefit? Okay, let's deal with some of these issues because they can help us deal with other environmental problems, other health problems. Air quality causes other health problems. It's other environmental problems for this. Well, let's just get rid of diesel cars and coal, and we can kind of tackle climate change and air quality issues and health issues. So whether this can kind of be linked together or not, it's a real question. It's open still.
Tomas Maltby, thank you very much. That was truly fascinating. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.